Let's go live. Here we are. How's everybody doing tonight? Welcome to Unit 8 of our AP US History Review. We are mere hours away from the exam. So 72 hours, something like that. So it's coming up close. And we got to just keep pressing on until we get to where we got to get. So thanks for joining me tonight. Let me go ahead and get everything aligned here so I can see what's going on. Outstanding. All right, as I said, and we went over... Dana, thank you so much. I went back and watched the end of the video, and I did talk about World War II last night. I just didn't remember. I mean, I think that all of these reviews are kind of starting to mesh together in my head, and the ones I'm doing in the afternoon and the ones I'm doing in the evening, and I don't know whether I'm coming or going. So thank you for double checking that for me, because we did absolutely cover World War II last night, which means we can get right into Unit 8 tonight, and we can start talking about the Cold War. So if you guys are ready, let's hit it, because we got to get busy. Time period 8. This goes from 1945 to 1980, and essentially 1945 represents two things. The end of World War II, but the beginning of the Cold War, because they essentially are one and the same. And it ends with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. When you look at this title screen here, what you're seeing is the big ideas, or some of the big ideas of this time period. The Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, the Great Society. All of that happens during Unit 8. It's a fascinating time period to study. And I think it's this time period that you guys are most familiar with. Even though you're not alive during this time period, this is recent enough where you've probably heard people discussing it and comparing and contrasting different events from this time period to ones that we're living today. 1945 to 1980, America officially emerges as a superpower. And you can attribute that to the victory in World War II. You can attribute that to our use of atomic weapons, because we are the first nation to have atomic weapons. And we're going to see that very quickly the Soviet Union is going to try to get on board, and we're going to see a race develop out of that. And economically, we're a superpower as well. We are the country coming out of World War II that is advanced of everybody else, just because of our geography, because of our advancements in technology, and quite honestly, because of our military. The themes, like I said, during this time period, we're looking at the Cold War, we're looking at the Civil Rights Movement, and we're looking at social change. We're going to see society make a major shift during this time period, one that hasn't been experienced before, and that happens primarily in the later 60s going into the 1970s. Now, when we talk about the Cold War, we got to talk about containment. Containment was our response to communism. We come out of the World War II. Now, if you remember correctly, the Soviet Union was one of our primary allies. Doesn't mean we agree with them, because they are still the communist country, and we still see communism as a threat to our country and our way of life. So what our goal is to keep communism where it is. It exists, we know that, but we got to maintain it where it is and not allow it to spread. If you think about it, the theory of containment is kind of like the idea that was presented by the Free Soil movement. If you remember correctly, the Free Soil movement was all about, we recognize where slavery is and we recognize that it exists, we just don't want it to spread. Same thing with communism. We want to prevent communism from spreading to the rest of the world. This is where the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan come into play. Now, the Truman Doctrine was drafted by President Truman with the sole intent of containing communism. He's focused on Greece and Turkey at this point, but it's not just Greece and Turkey. He's talking about containing communism wherever it spreads. And that's coming out of the report that was issued called the Long Telegram by George Kennan, when he said, listen, communism is here to stay, and they're looking to spread. So Truman Doctrine is going to be issued to stop the spread of communism. The Marshall Plan is about money. And the Marshall Plan, the idea is we are going to stop the spread of communism by supporting Western European countries financially, because communism breeds in poverty. And to prevent poverty from becoming an attraction to communism, we're going to pump funding into European countries to help them recover from the war, help them start to rebuild, and hopefully rebuild their economies so that they'll shift more to a democratic forms of government versus seeking help from the communists. We're going to see alliances being built during this time. And it's going to be split right down the line. Communist nations versus non-communist nations. NATO is going to be developed, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was an organized or an alliance of the United States and Western European countries who are coming together, also working to contain communism. In response to NATO being formed, the Warsaw Pact is going to be created. And the Warsaw Pact is an alliance between all the Soviet bloc nations. And then you're going to see that grow to start to include China, because China is going to quickly turn to communism shortly after the World War II. But the very first, physical war of the Cold War is going to be the Korean War. And the Korean War was fought on the Korean Peninsula, and you had North and South Korea divided right in the middle along the 38th parallel, and North Korea wanted to be a communist nation, and South Korea wanted to be a democratic nation, and they're going to fight for control of the peninsula. The United States is going to get involved, the United Nations is going to get involved, all hoping to stop North Korea from growing and actually try to overcome North Korea. The war is fought to a stalemate. In fact, if you want to get into the technical terms of everything, we're actually still at war because a ceasefire was declared, an armistice was declared, but there was never any treaty. There was never any official cessation of fighting. So the Korean War fought to a stalemate. The 38th parallel still the major dividing line between South Korea and North Korea. I don't think I would count that as a victory for the containment of communism, because it's in North Korea now, it's in China now. One way that we're going to try to curtail communism is by building a stronger, better military. And you're going to see an arms race develop during this time period. It started with the United States when they had the first atomic bomb. And then the Soviets are going to create an atomic bomb. And then the United States is going to create a hydrogen bomb. And then the Soviets are going to create a hydrogen bomb. And then the United States is going to create an even bigger bomb. And then the Soviets are going to create an even bigger bomb. And it is just one-upmanship of who can have the most powerful weapons for their nation. And what that brings us into is this period called MAD, or mutually assured destruction. And simply put, we built on both sides so many nuclear weapons, nobody wanted to fire them, because once one nuclear weapon is fired, all of them will be, and that's going to lead to the destruction of all of us. So in a roundabout sort of way, the arms race kept peace in the world, kept us from going to nuclear war, because no one wanted to be the country that pushed that button and then risk their country's lives as well, because once one missile's flying, you can quickly get another missile up in the air. They cross over, and then everything's gone. So mutually assured destruction is an effect of the arms race during this time period. Okay? The space race is also going to grow out of this as well. Did I skip one? The space race is essentially going to be, the arms race is going to evolve to, now we want to get to space. And so who can get to the moon first? And so while we're building these weapons, we're also building these satellites, and we're building these rockets and these ships that can go up into space outside of our atmosphere. And the Soviets had the lead on that, quite honestly, through most of the space race until we got to the moon first, and then boom, it's all about who wins at the end. It's not about how it starts. This drive to contain communism is going to cause the second Red Scare in American history. We know the first one happened in the early 1900s. Now we're seeing the second Red Scare come out, and basically it's this fear of communism having influence in our country. And we are really worried that communism is actually within our government. A man by the name of Joseph McCarthy is going to enter to enter into public knowledge that he has a list of State Department employees who are communists. And that's going to start the McCarthy hearings. And essentially, we're going to start, well, it starts with HUAC. I'm sorry, let's take a step back. The House on Un-American Activity Committee, they're formed in the 1940s, coming right out of the war. And what they're doing is they're investigating possible communists throughout our country. And if you suspect a communist in your neighborhood, you might want to let HUAC know, because they'll come and take them away. And if you want a really good representation of the Red Scare during the 1940s and 50s, there's an old episode of The Twilight Zone, and they remade it in I think the early 2000s, but it's called The Monsters on Elm Street. And that when Rod Serling created that story, it was a reflection of the Cold War and how people started turning on each other and pointing fingers at each other, saying, well, you must be a communist because you do this way, and you must be a communist because you do it that way. And what he does in the series or in the episode is he uses aliens. Everyone's suspected of being an alien, which is, I don't know if that was purposely did that because we call our illegal immigrants aliens. I don't know. That's interesting. Now I'm just having a thought, something to ponder later tonight. But this is going to lead into McCarthyism. Joseph McCarthy is going to come out of the HUAC committee. He is going to say, I have all these people on the State Department who are communists. He's going to start hearings, and then he's going to go even a step further and says, there's communists in the Army. And so he's going to start having the McCarthy Army hearings, and they were broadcast on live TV. And we saw kind of what a completely unfounded accusations that McCarthy was making against people in our military. And the American people really started to turn against McCarthy and looking at him as like, this has gone way too far. And so that's going to be the end of McCarthy. He's going to go away disgraced. But again, another fear of another government coming in and other ideas coming in and overtaking our democratic values. All right, let's talk a little bit more about society, because while we were afraid of communism, we were still living a pretty good life. We had a lot of prosperity after the war. You saw a lot of growth, economic growth after the war. In fact, you can almost do a comparison of the 1920s to the 1950s. The 1920s coming out of World War I, a lot of economic prosperity, a lot of cultural change, a lot of growth. The culture coming out of the 1950s, or out of World War II, the 1950s, we got a lot of economic growth, a lot of social change, a lot of stuff like that being introduced. Now, one thing that's going to help with the prosperity is the passage of the GI Bill. Soldiers are going to be coming home and they're going to be given money, essentially, for education or to start businesses or to buy homes. And so the soldiers are going to come home, they're going to start their families, and we're going to enter into the time period known as a baby boom, where we see millions of babies born between 1946 and 1963, I think, is the official range of the baby boom. And we're going to see a huge population growth during this time period. Now, a lot of these people, the question is, where are they all going to live? And they're going to start moving out to the suburbs. You're going to see the suburbanization of American society. And it's going to be introduced by the Levitt brothers. They're going to create Levitt towns. And Levitt towns were essentially these huge neighborhoods of these cookie cutter houses where they all look the same. They could literally build a house in a day. But they were inexpensive. And they were a great starter home for these young families. And so people were moving out to the suburbs. And within the suburbs, you could find everything you needed. Because it wasn't just the neighborhood. It was stores, it was schools, it was churches. And so you see people leaving the cities and moving out to the suburbs. The downfall of that, which we'll talk about a little bit in the 1960s, is the people left behind in the cities. They're staying in the cities because they can't afford to go to the suburbs. So as a result of that, you're going to see an economic decline in our cities during this time. You're also going to see another migration of people into what's known as the Sun Belt, which is essentially the southern half of our country. And the big draw of the Sun Belt was all of these new defense industries that are popping up, to keep us going in the arms race and to keep us fighting containment. They're building all their factories down in the south, across the southern section of our country. And they can do that because a new invention came out called air conditioning. And air conditioning is not only going in factories, it's going in homes. So a lot of people are going to say, man, why am I going to stay up here in the cold north when I can be down in Florida or down in Arizona and I can live a nice life and just use my air conditioning? So that's kind of what's going on, how we're seeing a lot of movement of people during this time period. We're going to be inspired by television. Television is to the 1950s what radio was to the 1920s. And on television, we saw what the perfect American family looked like. We were watching shows like Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver and Ozzie and Harriet. And what we saw is that typical American family, two adults, two kids, a dog, a car, a TV, and we said, this is what we want to conform to. And so you saw American society conform to this ideal of the perfect family and what that should look like. And so conformity was a big idea during the 1950s, but not everybody conformed. We're going to see a cultural rebellion against this conformity called the Beat Generation. And the Beat Generation was populated by young adults, teenagers, stuff like that, who said, I don't want to be like my mom and dad. And so I'm going to do everything opposite of them. And I'm going to dress in, totally different than how they dress. And I'm going to listen to different music than they listen to. And so you start to see this rebellion amongst the young people. And we refer to it as the Beat Generation. And they had the nickname the Beatniks. But what you're also going to see is the Beatniks later are going to evolve into the 1960s into what we call the hippie culture. So this is the beginning of that. The civil rights movement is going to take a big jump during the 1950s and 60s, and a lot of that has to do with the Double V program from World War II, in which the African Americans were over in Europe saying, we're going to fight for victory in Europe, but then we're going to go fight for victory in at home too, because we should have the same democratic rights that we're trying to defend in this war. And one of the most monumental movements during our moments in this time was the Brown v. Board decision. Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas is going to overturn the long-standing ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson. And if you remember correctly, Plessy v. Ferguson legalized segregation throughout our country. Brown v. Board is going to overturn that. It's going to say separate is not equal. Now it's going to start in the schools, but then it's going to start to expand to society as a whole. You're going to see one group immediately step up to say, we're going to go with this. And that's going to be the Little Rock Nine. And what they're going to do is they are going to try to enroll 9 African-American students into Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. Southern State's not happy about the Brown v. Board of Education ruling, and so they are going to resist. They're going to try to block the Little Rock Nine from getting into school that first day, where Governor Orville Faubus is going to bring out the state guard, and they're going to stand guard, and the police are going to be there, and they're not going to let these kids into the school. When Dwight D. Eisenhower, president at the time, hears about this, he's going to send the 101st Airborne down into Little Rock, Arkansas to get those kids in school. And think about this. The role of the executive branch in our government is to enforce the law. And that's exactly what Eisenhower's doing. He's using the power of the military, but they're going down to enforce the ruling that the Supreme Court made. And that's how our checks and balances work. That's how separation of powers works. So you're going to see that. You're also going to see several episodes of African-American students trying to get into different colleges and stuff like that. You might want to look up a few of those and just be familiar with them. I think what everyone's real familiar with is the Montgomery bus boycott. They might not be familiar with the, quote, Montgomery bus boycott, but they know Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks is going to take a seat on that bus representing the NAACP. She's going to be arrested, and this is going to lead to a year-long boycott of the public buses in Montgomery. And the purpose of this is to affect economically the businesses of Montgomery, Alabama, to force change. But the big thing that came out of the Montgomery bus boycott is a young leader by the name of Martin Luther King Jr. He is going to oversee this boycott, and this is going to launch him to a national presence in the civil rights movement. And then we're going to see, after the success of the bus boycott, we're going to see other types of protests happening and stuff like that. For instance, the Greensboro Four in North Carolina, they're going to use sit-ins to invoke public change during this time period. We're also going to see not just bus boycotts in Montgomery, but we're going to see the attempt to essentially desegregate bus stations throughout the South with the freedom rides of the summer of 1960, I believe. And they're going to run into a lot of problems. But when really things are really going to start heating up, so you're going to see some movement, you're going to see some change in the 1950s. Then we get to the 1960s, and this is where you're going to see some major victories. The March on Washington in 1963 is probably the pivotal moment, and we can all picture Martin Luther King Jr. standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial giving his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. He starts his speech with the grievances of how African Americans have been mistreated and why this movement is necessary. But then he ends his speech with the vision for what America could be, with if we all came together as one and it weren't divided by races. And again, when you think about this is kind of, if you think about like when the Declaration of Independence was written, the first part of it was all the grievances we had against Great Britain, and then Thomas Jefferson closes it out with what America could be, what the next step is, everything like that. So it's kind of interesting. I don't know where this stuff comes from. God just puts it in my head and I say it. Martin Luther King's speech is going to motivate the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. Finally, we have a Civil Rights Act. It's going to be signed by Lyndon B. Johnson, who is the president following JFK's assassination. And then the next year, he's going to sign the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, Martin Luther King Jr., he promoted nonviolent, peaceful protests, civil disobedience. However, not everybody was happy with the progress that was being made. In fact, they said it's not fast enough. And so while Martin Luther King Jr. is promoting nonviolence, you're going to see groups and people like Malcolm X and the Black Panthers say, no, we want our rights now. And if that means we have to fight, then we will fight. And so you see a more violent approach to civil rights start to move in as we go into the later, the mid to later 1960s. The civil rights movement is going to spur other movements in society. The women's movement is going to start to take off as we go into the late 60s. Betty Friedan is going to write the book, The Feminine Mystique. She is going to organize the National Organization of Women now, and that they're going to be fighting for the ERA amendment, the Equal Rights Amendment. And though it makes it through Congress, it's never ratified by the states. So the Equal Rights Amendment never actually it gets put on the Constitution. But this is the time period when the feminist movement really starts to take off. I mean, you really start to see more of a huge societal movement towards rights for women during this time period. You're also going to see movements among the Latino people. Cesar Chavez is going to go to bat for farm workers and stuff like that, and they're going to organize and have strikes to get better working conditions and more money for our farm workers. The Native Americans, AIM, the American Indian movement, is going to launch up in the early 1970s, and what they're really fighting for is self-determination. They want our Native American nations have been seen as independent nations throughout a lot of our history, and they want that back. They want to be able to govern themselves. And then, of course, the LGBTQ movement, the Stonewall riots, is going to spur that movement, seeking rights for gay people throughout our country. And you're going to see a lot more activism in their protests and everything like that. So the civil rights movement, we tend to think of it just for African Americans, but it expands to encompass all sorts of different groups in the American society. Let's get back to the Cold War, because you're going to see the Cold War is going to start heating up, if you will, because we're going to see our government get involved in other countries with helping overthrow what we considered, communist governments and supplanting those governments with American-friendly governments. And sometimes that meant we put some dictators in place. And this was this happened in both Latin America as well as Iran. And think about Iran, that's going to come back and bite us back in the late 1970s with the Iranian hostage crisis, because the friendly relationship that the United States had with the Shah of Iran, who was a dictator, is going to upset the people of Iran, where you're going to see a militant group rise up, overthrow the Shah, and that's going to lead to the Iran hostage crisis, which was a direct attack on American citizens who were in Iran. But I think the biggest thing we need to talk about during the 1960s especially is the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was kind of simmering ever since 1954 when Ho Chi Minh asked for the independence of Vietnam, and we said no. And he's going to lead a rebellion against the French, and that's going to end up with the French leaving Vietnam, and essentially that will divide Vietnam, just very similar to Korea in North Vietnam and South Vietnam. And America is trying to support a democratic government in South Vietnam, where Ho Chi Minh is leading the rebellion in North Vietnam. And just because they defeated the French doesn't mean he's going to give up. He wants all of the peninsula of Vietnam to be part of his communist government. The United States is going to get involved first by sending advisors over, but in 1964, there's going to be an interchange, or between U.S. ships and North Vietnamese planes, and the thought was, or the other North Vietnamese ships, and what we were told was our American ships were attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin, and that as a response, LBJ wanted to declare war. He wanted to go to war, and he didn't officially declare war, but what he did was he went to Congress and said, I need money to fight over in Vietnam, and they're going to sign the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And what's going to happen is the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution is going to give LBJ a blank check to do whatever he deemed necessary in Vietnam. And he's going to start sending troops over, and we're going to institute the draft to get more and more troops over there. And for the next 64 to about 73, 72, 73, we are involved in the Vietnam War. Now, initially, Americans supported this because we're trying to contain communism. But when we get to 1968, stories start coming out about what's actually happening over in Vietnam, atrocities that were being committed by the American troops. And it was during the Tet Offensive that Walter Cronkite came out and told the American people, we can't win this war. The best thing we can hope for is a tie, a stalemate. And when he said that, American people they kind of looked at each other and said, well, wait a minute. We've been told for the past 5 years or 4 years that we've been winning this war, that this fight against communism is making progress. And all of a sudden, Cronkite's telling us that ain't true. And what we realized was the government had been lying to us. And so that created this credibility gap between us and the government. And we started looking at the government completely different than we looked at it before. In the early, or throughout the 1800s, we looked at the government as just that agent, that group over there, and they weren't part of our daily lives. And then we come into the 1900s, and we're still kind of like, yeah, government, you just stay away, and we're good where we're at. And then the Depression hits, and Franklin Roosevelt institutes a New Deal, and then we have government involved in every aspect of our life, and we're kind of happy about that because our lives weren't too good in the Depression. Then we go to the war, and we come back a big victory, and we're like, cool, and the government says we got to fight communism, and we're like, all right, cool, we'll fight communism because they've never led us astray before. And then here we are in 1968, and they're like, they've been lying to us. And then the Pentagon Papers are going to come out saying it's not just Johnson, it was Kennedy and Eisenhower. We haven't heard the whole story about Vietnam. And so that's when you're going to see a lot of protests rising up against the Vietnam War and against the Vietnam War draft. And so this whole movement starts in the late 1960s. That's not just about protesting the Vietnam War. It's protesting the government and protesting the American way of life and all of that other stuff. And they start calling for a withdrawal from Vietnam. And Nixon in 1968 is going to run on that. He's going to say, I'm going to use a program called Vietnamization, where we're going to start turning this war over to the Vietnamese, and we're going to get the Americans out of here. He'll get elected, and then he'll start that program, but it was a very slow program because first he felt like he needed to invade or send air raids into Cambodia, but that's a whole other thing. This counterculture movement, though, is going to kind of sweep through America, you're going to see it really prevalent in California, in Haight-Ashbury, and places like that. And again, it's kind of like an anti-conformity and anti-American values. And you're going to see young people embrace this lifestyle that was centered on music and drugs and free love. And they're going to, Woodstock is a great representation of that. Them all coming together and just, saying, the heck with everybody else out there, to heck with this war, to hell with, the government and stuff. We're just going to do our own thing. You're also going to have some major Supreme Court decisions during this time period. You might want to go back and review some of those. This is the Warren Court. Be familiar with some of their cases. Engel versus Vitale, I believe that's the one that removed prayer from public school. Miranda versus Arizona, which is why they have to read you your Miranda rights. So the Supreme Court was active in the 1960s and 70s as well. While dealing with the war, Johnson's also dealing with poverty in our country. I mentioned to you that under the suburbanization of America, you have a lot of people living in urban areas that just they can't get by. They can't get good jobs, and they're living in poverty. So Johnson's going to declare his Great Society, which was his war on poverty, where he's going to start infusing a lot of money, tax money, into rebuilding society and rebuilding a structure that's going to help the poor. And he's going to create the Medicare system and the Medicaid system. They're going to put a lot of money into education, like Head Start programs and stuff like that. And so as we're going through the 60s, I want you to keep this in mind. We're spending a lot of money in Vietnam, and now we're spending a lot of money on these social programs. And that's going to come, someone's going to have to pay the bill eventually. Another major thing that's going to happen that we tend to overlook during the 1960s, during Johnson's presidency, is we get rid of the immigration quotas. You remember the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 and the National Origins Act of 1924? They've been in play this whole time. And that's going to be eliminated in the 1960s as well. Next, I want to talk about, the 1970s, because what's going to happen is the 1970s, we're going to become a nation in crisis, if you will. The economy is going to hit a major recession, and a lot of that has to do with all the government spending that had occurred, honestly, since World War II. I mean, we've been spending. Johnson was given that blank check with regards to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and so stagflation is going to set in. And stagflation was this new economic term that basically meant we were in a recession. That means prices are going up, interest rates are going up. Life is hard. We had an energy crisis during this time. You had the oil embargo coming out of OPEC, and so we had a gas shortage during the 1970s, and we had inflation. You put recession and inflation together, and we just called it stagflation. So our economy was stagnant. It wasn't growing. And an economy needs to grow to be healthy. It doesn't have to grow fast. 3 or 4% growth is perfect. But we weren't growing at all. The president at the time, or all the presidents of the 70s, didn't have an answer for this. But Nixon, he was kind of focused on some other stuff. One of the first things that's going to happen in his presidency is the War Powers Act is going to be passed. And what the War Powers Act did was essentially took away that power that the Gulf of Tonkin resolution gave to the president at the beginning of the Vietnam War. Nixon saw, I mentioned the Pentagon Papers earlier, the War Powers Act, and other things as attacks against him, attacks to undermine his presidency. And so he believes there's all this, espionage going on against him and stuff. And this is going to be what leads to the Watergate scandal, where Nixon is caught with his hand in the cookie jar, trying to break into the Democratic National Headquarters, trying to get the secrets of their campaign for the 1972 presidential election, and getting caught red-handed. And what's sad about it is Nixon would have won easily. He didn't need any of that, but his ego and his lack of I guess not his ego, but his lack of ego, because he was so worried that everybody was out to get him, that's what drove him to this scandal. Other major things that are going to happen during the 1970s, you had the Roe v. Wade decision for abortion rights. You also had the rise of the new right, the moral majority, Jerry Falwell and others, who are going to start calling for law and order within our society. Remember, we're dealing with all these crazy hippies. of the 60s and 70s and this counterculture movement and all this other stuff. So the moral majority is going to rise saying we need to, we need to get back to the basics. We need to get back to the ideologies that made our country great again. And so you're going to see this new conservative movement start to grow during the 1970s. And on top of that, you're going to see other movements, environmentalists. One thing that Nixon did during his presidency is he created the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, that was designed, like it says, to protect land, water, and air. But we never really thought about that until we started seeing some geological crises in our country and environmental crises with oil spills and stuff like that. Rachel Carson's going to write a book called Silent Spring, talking about the danger of pollution and pesticides. And so you're going to see this environmentalist movement start. And so the EPA is going to be created as a result of that environmentalist movement. So that's really, that's going to take us through the 1970s. I could talk about Carter, but there's not much to talk about. I guess he had the Camp David Accords, and he gave back the Panama Canal to Panama. I would talk about Ford, but he was just there in a blink of an eye. Going out of the 1970s, we are looking, that conservative movement's growing. We're looking for someone who can come in and help bring strength back to our country, because during the 1970s, we lost our mojo. That's the simplest way I can put it. We just lost our mojo. And so that's going to lead us into the 80s looking for new leadership and strong leadership, which is going to bring us to the election of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan's election is going to close out this time period, and it's going to open us up to time period, our next time period 9. But remember, just in closing, I'm just going to throw it out there. From 45 to 80, so during the Cold War all the way up until the election of Ronald Reagan, we are going to redefine our identity. We are going to become a global superpower. We're going to redefine our domestic identity. We're going to go from conformity to not conforming. We're going to go from the perfect family to the hippie movement. We're going to be going from trusting the government, because we had no reason not to having this huge credibility gap between us and the government, saying we can't trust them at all. And we've never overcome that credibility gap. We're still dealing with that today. And those themes of power, protest, reform, all of that basically encapsulates the Unit 8 time period, 1945 to 1980. So there you have it. There it all is, kind of wrapped up in a nice little bow. Took me a little longer tonight. I'm almost at 40 minutes, but I'll give you a minute here to ask me any questions if you're actually in the chat, and you can use it. While we're doing that, I'll just change. I'll pull up Doggy Cam so you can see who my buddy is right here next to me this whole time. He's been laying right in here next to me as we did that. Here comes Gilligan, because I mentioned him. So yeah, got the Doggy Cam going tonight. So anyway, say hello, doggies. You get to see both of them. Yeah. All right. And what do you have? He has something in his mouth. I'm going to have to figure that out. Anyway. All right. Okay, 2 questions, Dana. Lay them on me. What do you got? While I'm figuring out what Flynn has in his mouth. What do you got? Oh, he's got paper. He's got my little sticker. Okay. Go ahead, Dana. I'm waiting. I'll be patient. Here we go. What? The awkward silence as we wait. As we're waiting for Dana's questions, I just want to throw out there that I am not going to do a Unit 9 review. And for those of you who might just be watching, typically the vast majority of the exam is Units 3 through 8. So that's where I focus these live reviews. Now, on Thursday night, I'll be doing a live review on YouTube right here, starting at 7:30, and I'll be here to answer all your questions. So if you have questions about time period 9, or even for that matter, time period 1 or 2, I'll be happy to answer it. So no, go ahead. If it's about, I'm sure other people have questions about the writing portion, so go ahead and throw those out there, because I'm happy to answer those now as well. Because I'd rather answer these questions while they're fresh in your mind than say, oh, I'll ask you later, and then you forget. So this is your time. I am here to help you any way I can. So, when we talk about writing, honestly, I was talking to someone today who asked me, he goes, I got the content down, really well, but I'm really concerned about writing and how am I going to translate the writing to, or the content I have, the content knowledge I have to writing. And I'm like, dude, if you have the content, you can write about anything. So the question is, when writing any of the two, is it okay if there's a lot of repetition of certain phrases? Like, could I get points? Okay, I'm wondering if you're asking me if you have a formula for when you're writing the paragraph. So you could say something along the lines, was document 1 demonstrates that, the summary of document 1 is this happened, and this answers the prompt because of this, and this, was written because of this. And you're doing that. No, you're okay with that. When you write on the APSA, or whether it's the LEQ or the DBQ, this is a rough draft essay, and that's how the graders read it. They're reading it as a rough draft. So if you're repeating yourself as far as the different phrases you're using, you're perfectly fine. Now you can't repeat the same evidence over and over again, but they're not going to take any points off if you have any grammar errors. They're not going to take any points off if you have any spelling errors. And like I said, if you are essentially just repeating phrases, over and over again just to keep that formula going, you're perfectly fine. The other thing I want you to remember, Dana, is they're never going to take points off. What they're doing is they are looking at how they can give you points. So don't think that they're going to be reading and saying, oh man, she had a 5, but I don't like how she phrased that, so there's a 4. That ain't going to happen. So yeah, so hopefully, I see that answers. Okay, cool. So I got another question here. If an LEQ was asking about the extent of foreign affairs from time period 8, would it be better to president to write off of JFK or Carter? JFK is, I think, a great place, because from JFK you can build off of that, and you can build into the foreign policy of Johnson, and then you can take that into the foreign policy of Nixon. So Carter, when you talk about his foreign policy, I mean, his foreign policy is primarily focused on kind of almost along the lines of the moral diplomacy that Wilson had, where he wants to help spread democracy and he wants to help other nations in need. But his actual foreign policy accomplishments are, I think, limited to the Camp David Accords and maybe the Panama Canal. But he also has that shadow of the Iran hostage crisis, which I'll give him credit. He did everything he could to bring that to an end, but he just wasn't successful. So yeah, if I'm gonna write about the extent of foreign affairs, I would start with Eisenhower and just use, because you can talk about you can talk about a lot of people, but JFK, I would use him before I would use Carter, if that answers your question, Johnny Cochran. So, all right, any other questions? Cool. I finally got some questions. I'm kind of excited. It's been a while. So, what would your preferred strategy be for tackling counter arguments? Like if you were out. Okay, here's the deal with counter arguments. Counter arguments are great if you have one. I don't want you to stress about coming up with one. What the advice I'm gonna give my students, Dana, you included, is the advice I'm gonna give my students is that when you're writing your essay, what you want to do is, if you have a counter argument, you're going to end your essay with that counter argument. But if you don't have a counter argument, that just might prevent you from getting that complexity point. But the complexity point is not necessary for you to pass the exam. But should you have a counterpoint? So if you're evaluating the extent of the development of a new American identity, and you would talk about all the conformity and everything, but then you wanted to talk about the counterculture movement of the 1960s. All you would do is go ahead and write your strengths. So write about the culture of the 1950s leading into the 1960s, and you're talking about conformity as an example, and then you go into a final few statement where you say, however, though conformity seemed to be the norm of American society, there was a movement that counteracted that conformity, and that was the beatnik movement or the counterculture movement, and then give an example of that. So that's exactly what I would do. Is I would start with writing about the main the main parts of the American society during that time period, and then add your but statement at the end. So hopefully. All right, Colin, what do you think the main difference is between the New Deal programs and the Great Society programs? A focus on poverty. I think poverty is obviously the center point of the Great Society programs. The New Deal programs were more designed to, what's the word I'm looking for? To light a fire under our economy, to give Americans hope and stuff like that. And while the Great Society was also trying to help the economy, the Great Society actually created more permanent change in our government as far as economic changes versus the New Deal programs. Remember, the New Deal, a lot of those programs were temporary, like the CCC, the WPA, the AAA, stuff like that. So those were temporary solutions for an immediate problem. The Great Society, I would say those were more long-term solutions for what Johnson saw as a long-term problem for our country. But I think you're right. I think it centers around more of the poverty of our country, where the New Deal centers around more about the current economic condition of the entire country, if that helps. Do I think if Washington had never had his farewell address, we would see more presidents with 3 terms? Honestly, no. Because Washington's farewell address didn't address the 2 terms. He lived the example. That's essentially what he did. He served the 2 terms, and by living out the example, others followed that. So I think the 2-term precedent that he set was more not for anything he said, but for what he did. It's kind of like, don't do there's that old saying, do as I say, not as I do. Washington is more of do as I do. Don't worry about what's said. So yeah, I think we would have still had the same number. And quite honestly, I think what our elections have told us is that the American people probably wouldn't have voted anybody else in, because remember, 3 terms was not illegal, or wasn't. It was allowed until the 1950s. There was nothing in the Constitution that prevented that from happening. But I think, number one, we wanted to follow Washington's lead. And number 2, I don't think the American people found a president they wanted to stick around for 3 terms. So there you go. All right. Any other questions? Thank you for the questions. They make my night. They make me feel like I'm doing something instead of just talking. So, all right. Okay, well, do I think Lincoln is overrated? No, I don't think Lincoln is overrated. I think Lincoln, what's great about Lincoln is that he came in as one president, but he went out as a completely different president because he changed his viewpoints. Remember, he came in as a free soiler. He wasn't ready to put slavery to bed in our country. But once the war got started, he recognized that this is a cancer in our society and we need to deal with it. And that's going to be what led to the Emancipation Proclamation. And think about it also. Lincoln had to deal with something that no other president had to deal with. He had to deal with a war within our country. And so he had to figure that one out. So to say he's overrated, no, I don't think so at all. I think, the credit he's given is the credit he's due. Do I think that this period is one of the periods that we should emphasize? Here is my thought on time period 8, and I have absolutely no scientific research for this. But it's been a while since we've seen like a DBQ or LEQs that, LEQs will encompass time period 8, but DBQs, they haven't been around time period 8. SAQs, again, I don't think we've seen a lot, that I remember. So there's a lot of important things that happened. I'm trying to, like I said, Dana, I have no scientific research. It's just I'm kind of hoping the Cold War is part of the DBQ, because that's what everybody just covered and it's fresh in our minds. But I would give it, honestly, the same attention that I would give the other time periods, where you might want to save some time, which I hate saying this, but wars are generally not talked about much in the exam. So I wouldn't spend a lot of time getting down to the nitty gritty of the, excuse me just a second. Flynn, get out of there. I wouldn't get into the nitty gritty of the different wars and stuff, just understand why they happened and how they turned out. So, but other than that, I would say, I mean, it always feels like the early periods, like 3, 4, and 5, are where they tend to put a lot of focus. But then when you start breaking down the questions, it's that nice even dispersion. Depend whether it's multiple choice or writing. Every unit between 3 and 8 gets a solid look at. Remember, periods 1 and period 9 is just 5% of the exam. Period 2 is, I think, like 8% of the exam. So review that. Don't blow those off. But yeah, I would love it if there was a lot on the Cold War, because like I said, you guys did really good on our exam, and I would love to see that replicated, but I don't know. Okay? All right. So thank you again for questions. I don't see any more popping in. Just to give you a second before I sign off, I'm not on tomorrow night. I'm taking tomorrow night off, and then Friday night. Friday night's not going to do any good. Thursday night, I'm going to come on. I'll come on at 7:30 our time, and you guys are going to drive this. Just like you ask questions tonight, I'm going to need questions on Thursday night, and I will answer questions as long as you guys are asking them. I can do little overviews of each time period. I don't want to get into a whole presentation of them, but I will, talk about the various time periods, and I will answer any questions you have. So between now and Thursday night, start forming some questions for me. If you're tired of looking at my face and listening to my voice, Heimler's going to be out there too. He's going to have his live reviews going on. I'm not sure what time they start. I want to say they start roughly at about, I think, 6 o'clock our time. It's either 6 or 7 our time. So those are out there. There's other reviews going on. So use the time these next 2 evenings, not cramming, but reviewing and using the tools and the people that are out there, who are ready to help you. Okay? But for now, I'm going to say goodnight. As always, I appreciate you guys joining me. You can help me out liking this video, hitting a subscribe, share it with somebody. But until Thursday night at 7:30, we will see you later, and go out and go learn some more history. All right? Have a great evening. Good night.